Living in the segregated South of America was nothing short of unforgettable for those who experienced it. Segregation was a way for racist white America to keep their hold of power over black America. Setting white and black America apart from each other caused many obstacles and hardships on black America.
Segregation unofficially started during Reconstruction through the use of black codes, which were laws that dictated where black people could live and work. 3 decades after, in 1896, segregation was considered constitutional through the Plessy versus Ferguson case.
Religion played an integral part of the lives of those that lived through segregation, as Mr. Ganius and Mrs. Waller can attest.
Well, my family was a very religious family. I cannot remember anyone in my family promoting hatred for anyone because of their color or whatever. We just treated people the way that we wanted to be treated.
I've always been a believer, but because we lived out in the country, we moved to Florida when I was 7 or 6. And where we lived between Thomasville Road and Centerville Road on Bradfordville Road. And there was no blacks out there, and there's only one church a couple miles away. And the majority of the time we were there, it didn't have church. So we really didn't go to church except for maybe a couple years. So, I don't really have an answer, for that.
Over half a century later, education transitioned from segregation to
At the
integration.
time that I was in school, elementary school, as well as in high school, it was segregated in the town that I grew up in. Encounter with integration was when I was in the 9th grade. And that was after I had left my hometown and I came to Connecticut, where I spent my freshman year in high school. And then after that, I went back to Florida.
What affected my education was that in the last year, 1965, at Leon High School, was the first year of segregation. There were 3 blacks that attended Leon High Schools, but as far as I know, there were no incidents, and they weren't in any of my classes. But all I remember is that they were friendly and they were smart.
Alongside religion, education was also impacted during segregation. Many fought against it, and Brown versus Board of Education rendered segregation of schools unconstitutional.
During this time, the Civil Rights Movement emerged in the year 1954 to 1968. Their agenda was to abolish racial segregation and discrimination. One of the known civil rights leaders was Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. He led the movement to end segregation through peaceful protests with his message of freedom, equality, justice, and love.
Alongside Martin Luther King, Malcolm X was another civil rights leader. Opposite to Dr. King, Malcolm X urged Black Americans to protect themselves against white aggression by any means necessary. He was also a practitioner of the Black Muslim faith, which combines religious aspects with Black power and Black nationalism.
In addition to Dr. King and Malcolm X, the Black Panther Party, or the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, was a civil rights group that formed in 1966 by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale to protect Black people from police brutality. Like Malcolm X, the Black Panther Party grew to advocate the arming of Black people to protect themselves by any means necessary. Even though their methods contrasted that of Dr. King's, all these groups sought the same goal: to have peace and equality.
Kind of like King's approach to it, because I think when you begin to take matters into your own hand, now you're just basically fomenting violence between violence, because I think violence foments or add fuel to the fire.
Conflict during this time could be physical or verbal.
I think it was my grandmother and a friend of mine who graduated from high school with me. We were in my hometown and we went over into Tallahassee, Florida, and we stopped at a gas station. There was 2 white guys inside a garage, And when we pulled up to the pump, they kind of just raised their head and looked at us and just basically ignored us. So being that I hadn't experienced that kind of thing in Connecticut, where people were really getting along with each other, whether they was black and white, I blew the horn. And one of the guys raised his head up and said, "Don't blow that horn at me, nigga." And so I said, well, you know, to my brother, I said, "Hey man, I don't want no problem here, so let's go." We just drove away. And that was basically the only racial issue that I can recall when I was.
Though the transition to desegregation was not always a peaceful one, a white supremacist group known as the Ku Klux Klan terrorized black people in their fight for equality. In 1964, less than a month before the Civil Rights Act was passed, 3 civil rights workers in Mississippi were arrested by Deputy Sheriff Cecil Price for speeding. These unfortunate 3 men were not brought to the county jail. They were instead taken to an empty road where a group of Klansmen were waiting for them. 2 of the civil rights workers were shot to death by the Klansmen, and the last man, however, was beaten with chains, then shot to death. But justice would not be quickly served for the 3 men and their families, as it would take to the year 1966 for any of the murderers to face justice. And what little punishment the murderers faced amounted to 10 years in prison, of which, at most, only 5 years were served. The justice system was and still is flawed. Despite showing obvious reluctance to integrate their schools, the U.S. government still showed the South leniency, in that they allowed extended time to integrate their schools or face federal defunding.
Segregation was a major impactful event for those who experienced it. From Plessy v. Ferguson to Brown v. Board of Education, civil rights made many breakthroughs to further foster social equality. While there was many improvements that were made, we as a society still have lots of work to do to ensure a better way of living for African Americans.
I'm Vivian, Vivian, middle initial L, last name Hobbs, Hobbs.
And then your date of birth and place of birth.
I'll give you my place of birth. How's that?
Okay.
I was born in Camilla, Georgia. Mitchell County, Georgia. I attended Bond Elementary School, and I transferred to FAMU High School. It was FAMU High School then, Florida High and FAMU High, not developmental research schools, but that's been a while ago. I graduated from there in 1961. I moved across the street to Florida A&M University and received a BA in English with minors in history, Spanish, and they told me political science.
So what do you remember about life before integration?
Oh my God, I was hoping you would save that for last because it's a nightmare and that'll take me off my high, but I will share it because I feel that I came out pretty much unscathed, except I have some terrible memories of that. And my grandparents were not slaves, but they lived on plantations. And on these plantations, they did the work on the plantation for the boss, or the boss man, as they called him. I remember a little of that because I told you I went to school up in Georgia until I was 6 years old. And then we moved to Florida, and we moved to a different kind of slavery. That's what I call it all. They worked from sunup to sundown when I was there. I remember that. And I'm talking about pretty much the kind of work they were doing. They were keeping house for the boss man. They were planting the fields, and the only thing we could do, or I'm saying we, but I mean my people, the only thing my people could do at that time was raise gardens at their home to take care of themselves and to do all the planting and all the cotton picking and all the tobacco picking and everything else that needed picking. And at the end of the year, they were not getting a salary for this. This was not salary. They were not getting a salary. And at the end of the year, they were just free to get whatever the boss man decided that they deserved for that year, or based upon, he said, upon the money that he brought in, he gave them a percentage. But I never believed that. I've always been one of those curious, inquisitive kinds who spent a lot of time with my grandfather, who had not really bought into this slavery thing. And he taught me a lot of things that probably most kids didn't know about what was going on at that time. That was another form of slavery. And the worst thing I remember is, though, when I was in high school down here at FAMU High, since we don't have forever to talk about this, when I was in high school down here at FAMU High, I know you must have heard of a Reverend C.K. Steele. Have you heard of him? Any of you? The C.K. Steele Plaza downtown where the buses go? And he had the church Bethel Baptist over on Tennessee Street at that time. And I actually was in the presence of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, because they were good friends when we started this. And FAMU, of course, was very, very active in the sit-ins, in the demonstrations. You're taking me back to a time when we had a McCrory's 5 and dime store here. I guess they were the equivalent of the dollar stores. We had a McCrory's 5 and dime here, and we had a Woolworths, just like you've read about in probably some of your classes, Carolina and other places. And they had counters in there where you could go shop downtown all day Saturday, give them all the money you had, which wasn't much. And they had lunch counters separate, and they were not equal, okay? And that's the part I remember so vividly, the separate and unequal rather than separate and equal. And that was kind of hard for me to understand. I mean, I was an only child, really filled up with self-importance. I had a grandparents, I was an extended family, grandparents there, mother there, the apple of everybody's eye. But then I always felt that there was something wrong with my not being able to sit where I needed to sit in that McCrory's when I'm spending the same amount of money that they were spending there, the others were spending there. Now that kind of stayed with me forever. But more than anything else, we could not go out at night. That was one of the things, because as much as I hate to talk about the KKK, the things that we did, that's as Black females and males in my age group, most of our activities were either church related or school related. We didn't have an outside life like you guys have. We didn't have telephones. We didn't have TikTok.
How did segregation impact you personally? Which I feel that story was definitely something that answered that question, but I definitely would like to hear more from you on that subject, if you're comfortable with sharing.
Well, I am very glad you asked me that, because that pulls me out of this mood of anger, because I just became angry all over. Somebody doesn't tell you I can't be your friend because of your skin tone. Now that still bothered me, and that bothered me all my life. It happened when we went into the military. I told you my husband went into the military, and I was with mostly whites because he was an officer. These were my husband's bosses. So I had to get along. You had to put your personal feelings aside to survive in that type of an environment, okay? So I was able to do that. But the one thing it did for me educationally was I wanted the opportunity to go to, you will never guess where, to Florida State. That's all those years, because they denied me when I had the grades to get in there and I had the test scores, and I wanted to show everybody over there, wherever I could go, where I could exhibit my grand knowledge. I wanted to show them that I was not only smart enough to be there, I was smarter than most of those who were there. So that's how that kind of segregated situation affected me.
Did segregation affect your decision to move or to come back? Did it affect your decision as far as living? And in general, what else do you remember?
Yes, let me tell you what I learned. I grew up thinking, oh my God, I can't wait to get out of the South. I left the South for the first time to live in Kansas. I did mention that. I don't know if you'd come on then. I found that people are no different, no matter where they are. If you're Black, and that's still an issue, you are a lesser human being. I welcome opportunities when I can show them I'm not a lesser human being. I'm better than you because I'm probably smarter than you. So that's how I have survived. And I learned that the South was no different from the North, from the West, from the Midwest. It was all the same. If you were Black, you were still a slave in their own heads.
During the making of this documentary, Faith, Ashlyn, and myself were granted the opportunity to interview two female educators who were both learning and teaching during the era of legal segregation. We feel that much is to be desired when looking at school curriculum and how it addresses the issue of segregation. Part of our effort to stress the importance of a broadened curriculum is using photos like these with color. They remind us that segregation was not long ago, but a little over 50 years. As our professor would say, history does not happen in a vacuum. Not only does our documentary showcase the importance of this idea, we will also define segregation and emphasize the significance of integration. The two female educators we interviewed were Miss Althemise Barnes.
Oh, hey, how are you?
And we discovered her old friend,
Annie Ruth Perryman, Faith's grandmother.
Since the late 1800s, segregation flourished within the school systems up until the mid-20th century. Children of color had restrictive educational opportunities due to the limited numbers of staff and resources in Black schools. In 1954, the Brown v. Board of Education decision to desegregate schools was established by the Supreme Court. Students and teachers of all colors gradually intertwined all across the nation. Though this may have seemed like a tremendous step forward for everyone, some people were not as fortunate as others.
We were separated because we had been this close-knit group of people. Many of us had just finished FAMU, and we were coming from different places, Pensacola, wherever. And, we had our little camaraderie ship or whatever. But for the first time, not by our choice, but we had to split up. And another thing with our administrators was that many of them were not retained at the level where they were serving. Like the principal at Lincoln was sent to the Lincoln Griffin to see those students out, see that through. And then he was put in the county office handling something, assistant personnel office or something like that. The coaches were sent to be an assistant coach or just teach driver's ed or health at either Leon, Ricketts, or whatever. They did not retain those higher level positions that they had been trained for and had been serving in.
Life went on as far as the way school that I knew it went on. And it was no problem at FSU because we were all just students. I didn't pay any particular attention to anyone's color or race or anything. I was scared to death as it was.
Though not everyone was directly impacted by the societal transition, there were several different attitudes about the changes at hand.
I don't remember being upset or anyone being really ugly or using foul language or anything around me. If anyone said anything, it was more like, I'm not going to go to school here if that happens. I'm going to go to a private school. that was never an option that my family would have made. We didn't have the money, and we were perfectly satisfied with the school where we were going. So it wasn't a big issue in my life at that time, in any time of my life.
There was a lot of fighting within the student body, though it was still pretty much all African American. But I don't know if having to leave their school and then come here faced with, we still want Lincoln on our diploma, had kind of heightened the tensions within the students or what. But it was just, and then you had the middle school students down on one end, which were mixed, then desegregated the middle school. Then you had the high school students up on the other end of the campus. So the mixture, I think, might have contributed to attributed to a lot of the can be attributed to a lot of the anxiety, act out behaviors maybe that took place in that setting.
With underlying hostility, segregation was not only absent from conversations, but also in school curriculum. Even today, there still remain some outliers in teaching racial segregation. Controversial political tools such as the critical race theory are used now to steer society into neglecting these essential aspects of African American history.
When I was coming up and in school, it was good for us to hear about the Little Rock Nine and the Bridges and Brown versus Board of Education. It was good for us to hear that, but it was like it was kind of a distant story for us. It was only after I became involved in a couple of jobs I had, one of which was to investigate discrimination complaints for the state of Florida, that I started to realize that it was more to this whole Brown versus Board of Education and school desegregation than I knew.
School segregation still appears in different forms today. A 2019 study revealed that majority non-white school districts typically receive $23 billion less than that of white school districts.
They might be segregated in the way in financial support, because some schools draw from a local community that is poor and parents are not involved. And so they don't come to school. Even in kindergarten, when I started teaching, children came to school not even knowing colors and not knowing shapes and, not even knowing what a sidewalk was, or so many things. And I feel like if you don't come to school prepared, knowing some of the basics, then it's just going to push you further and further behind.
There were certain classes that you found a predominance of Black students. It was either EH, emotionally handicapped, or it was like 2 or 3 different things that the students would be, I guess, tested in some way and placed in these classes. And for us, it kind of seemed like it was a way of separating again the students by race, but not saying it's by race, but it's because of a lack of ability to keep up.
Throughout this documentary, you have seen the perspectives of 2 former educators, Miss Althamise Barnes and Miss Annie Ruth Perryman. You have witnessed their differences in dealing with segregation, one more easy and laid back, likely due to the existence of racial privilege. At the conclusion of this documentary, we see that it remains how the social changes made within the school districts gives formidable illustration of how desegregation does not reach the equivalence of integration. Further steps must focus on cultivating more equity than equality. We may all eventually have equal opportunities, but without an equal starting point, those opportunities mean